My friends and I have this annual ritual. Every year, we get together and stay in a cabin up north. My friend Jake owns the cabin. Actually, it belongs to his father, but he lets us use it for a small fee. The cabin itself is incredibly nice both inside and out. Apart from having a mostly wooden exterior, and it being isolated up in the mountains, one might actually mistake it for a vacation spot. It was that time of year, and we all got together once again. Over the past years, it's just been me, Jake, and our two other friends, Chris and Mike. We started doing this yearly thing about 5 years ago when we all graduated from high school. We worried that we would lose touch with each other, and that we wouldn't see each other anymore, so we all agreed to meet up once a year and spend the weekend together. The first year was a bit rocky. Mike couldn't make it because he was being extremely overworked without being able to get any time off, so it was just Jake, Chris, and I. We didn't do a lot. We mostly just watched movies, played some video games, and ate all the junk food we had brought with us. The following year was much better. On this time, we all got time off from work and met up on the mountain. We almost broke our necks because we were sledding while intoxicated. We still played video games for most of the weekend, but before we left, Mike had felt bad about the previous year, so he brought a truckload of fireworks with him. We spent our last night there blowing up snow hills and filling the night sky with an incredible show of colors. The next year, we threw a large party up on the mountain. We had invited coworkers, old friends, and it was the first year I had brought Nikki with me. We had just started dating, and since we were inviting pretty much everyone we knew, I figure, well, what the hell, right? Everyone had a great time, or so they told me. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of party games, and a broken wooden deer carving that we had to pay Jake's dad back for it, but overall, it was a great time. Last year, we chose to limit the amount of people. We could only bring one additional person with us, just to keep the alcohol intake and damages to a minimum. Jake, Mike, and I all each brought our girlfriends. Chris, on the other hand, came alone. Anyways, as we spent that weekend watching old scary movies, playing board games, and taking hikes through the snowy wilderness, overall, it was a pretty good time. Last week, however, was anything but good. While Nikki and I were making our way up to the mountains, we had received a warning that a massive blizzard was heading our way. She gave me a nervous glance, but it had snowed up there lots of times before, and I told her not to worry about it. We had just arrived when the snowfall began to pick up. We grabbed our things and quickly dashed inside. We found Mike and Chris setting up a video game, and Jake in the kitchen putting away the food he had brought. I greeted them, then inquired to where their better halves were. They all said, almost in comical fashion, working. I laughed at the coincidence and took my jacket off. I asked Jake if he had seen the weather. He nodded, saying that we were going to get a few feet of snow, but nothing major. So we quickly settled in. After a few hours of watching Chris stomp Mike in Street Fighter, we all decided to watch some movies Jake had brought with him, his famous collection of scary movies, which I wasn't actually interested in, but of course, I was outvoted. While they put on the first movie, I stared out the window watching the endless snowfall outside. The sky was already darkened from the clouds overhead, but was now becoming much darker as the sun started going down. But something caught my attention through the flurry of snow. I wasn't sure, but I thought I saw someone standing out there. I blinked my eyes, and whatever it was wasn't there anymore. Thinking it was just the snow playing tricks on me, I rejoined everyone at the TV. About an hour into the film, Nikki had to use the bathroom, and a few moments later, we all jumped up to her screaming. Everyone else gave each other confused glances. As I ran to the bathroom, I found Nikki standing outside of the bathroom door. I asked what was wrong, and she just pointed to the window. She said that she saw something staring at her through the glass. Being the good boyfriend that I am, I puffed up my chest and walked over to the window. Looking closely through it, the only thing I could see was a thick layer of snow falling from the sky. By that point, our friends had joined us, and she told them what she saw. They all thought the movie had gotten to her, but I couldn't help but think about when I saw something standing outside as well. We decided to call it a night, and each retired to our respective rooms. Throughout the night, Nikki just kept glancing out of the window. I told her to relax. If it was somebody, there were 5 of us, and only one of them. This actually helped her calm down a bit. A couple of hours after we fell asleep, I was awoken to a tapping coming from the window. I cracked my eyes slightly open. On the other side of the glass was a face. It didn't look human. Its head was as white as the snow falling all around it, which contrasted the darkness outside. Its eyes were white and vacant, almost as if it were blind. A long, clawed hand tapped a pointed finger on the glass. It seemed like it was trying to get our attention, but the way it moved its head as it tapped made it seem like it had never touched glass before. After a few minutes of watching it, it slowly stepped backwards away from the window and faded from view. I immediately shook Nikki awake and told her what I saw. I could see the panic in her eyes slowly start to build as I described it. She told me that that was exactly what she had seen in the bathroom. We quickly got up and woke the others, explaining what I saw. They were all skeptical. They all didn't really believe us, but I told them that we needed to leave now. While everyone else was packing their things, I walked over to the door and opened it. Even though what I saw on the other side had stopped me in my tracks, there was a pile of snow about halfway up the door. I looked over the mound of snow and saw that our trucks had mostly been buried by the blizzard. I struggled to shut the door, but when I did, something happened that made us all stop what we were doing. There was a knock on the door. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to do. I locked the door quickly and told Chris to lock the back door. He nodded and ran off. We all stayed together in the living room, keeping our eyes fixed on the doors and windows. Nikki pulled out her cell phone, but with the bad weather and remote location, that was just wishful thinking. Mike started to shout in fear, and we all looked in the direction he was staring at. It was the window right next to the back door. That same ghostly white face was on the other side. It tapped on the window, then began to pound on it. The glass then began fracturing all over. Thinking quickly, I led everyone upstairs to the master bedroom. We all poured inside and locked the door behind us. I could hear the glass break shortly after. We all held our breath as we waited. A few minutes later, the sound of something could be heard below us. Then, everything went quiet. We looked to one another, not sure if we should check to see if it was gone or not. And Jake stood up and walked over to the door, but just as he went to reach for the lock, a faint tapping was heard on the other side. We all sat there motionless, hoping that whatever it was would get bored and just leave us alone. A few hours passed as we waited, and not a sound was heard. I got up and walked over to the door. I pressed my ear to the wood, and I could hear very soft breathing on the other side. I'm not sure why, but this out of everything scared me the most. That this fucking creature had been standing there, waiting for hours without making a single noise. Eventually, the sun began to rise, and the blizzard had finally died down. Chris, Jake, Mike, and I decided we would try to make a quick run to our trucks. We were going to force the door open and charge at whatever that thing was. Nikki, of course, advised against it, but we didn't have much of a choice. I counted to 3 and pulled the door open, but when I did, the creature was gone. We slowly crept downstairs and found all of our stuff was trashed. Our bags were torn open. The door to the fridge was practically torn from the hinges, and all the food was thrown everywhere around the cabin. We spent the morning shoveling our trucks out enough to drive out of there, and we all quickly left after that. We have no idea what that thing was, or what it actually wanted, but we all decided to postpone next year's trip to the cabin. If it's snowing outside at night, and you hear a tap on your window, get up and find somewhere safe. We were all very lucky, but if we hadn't been on the second floor with the door locked, I most likely wouldn't be writing this right now. I grew up in a small town just north of Anchorage, Alaska. My family had moved there only a few months after I was born. My father was a very outdoorsman. He grew up very traditional. His father and grandfather took him hunting and fishing whenever they could. They would spend so much time outdoors. In fact, going into town felt almost alien to them, or so my father liked to say. He grew up in Washington State, so he was already pretty much accustomed to the dense foliage that we live by today. Unlike his father or grandfather, who were both blue-collar men, he went to college and got a degree in engineering. In a job interview, he was so flustered by his nerves he couldn't seem to answer the questions correctly. He said it was a miracle that he even got the job. Of course, my mother likes to remind him of how awkward his interview was, as she's the only one that had interviewed him. My mother worked as a hiring manager for an engineering company in Washington. After a few years, my parents had gotten married, and a few more years after, I was well on the way. Their company was branching out to Alaska, and were asking for volunteers if anybody would be willing to relocate. My father jumped at the opportunity, much to my mother's surprise. They both made the trip, and after getting settled a few months later, I was born. Throughout most of my younger days, my father would always seem to find time to take me camping and fishing. Once I had gotten a little bit older, he began to take me hunting as well. I didn't really enjoy the act of hunting, but my father was so excited about bonding that I didn't have the heart to tell him. Years flew by, and every summer, it would be me and him trekking over mountains and through dense brush. For my 16th birthday, he and I spent an entire week out in the forest. It might not be the greatest birthday present for some of you, but that's what my family life consisted of, so it wasn't too bad. Sometime after my 18th birthday, my father had an unfortunate accident at work. He had a piece of sheet metal fall on him and injure his back. He was laid up in a hospital for almost a month, but thankfully wasn't in any danger. Once he was cleared to come home, he spent the majority of his time on the couch. His birthday was coming up soon. She asked me if I would be willing to go hunt something as a gift for my dad. I thought about it for a bit. While I hadn't gone hunting by myself before, I had gotten my license and knew all the procedures involved. I have also gone hunting almost every year since I was old enough to. I agreed and told my mom I would try to bring something back, but not to get her hopes up. She thanked me, and after a week or so, I had gotten everything that I needed. I packed up my truck, grabbed my rifle, and headed out. I drove about an hour and a half to our usual spot to begin our hunting. I hopped out of my truck, grabbed my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and began walking. Some of you might be surprised to find that the summer months can be pretty warm in Alaska. I have met visitors who were under the impression that Alaska was a winter wonderland all year round. And while that may be the case for some of the parts in Alaska, like further up north, it's not always true further south. It was a clear, sunny day overhead, and so I pushed my way through the thick brush. It seemed like a million mosquitoes wanted to take me down before I even got started. As I hiked further inward, keeping a close eye on my surroundings, I started to feel as if every animal was aware of my presence. My father was a better tracker than I was. I was mostly a few steps behind him, always staying quiet. During my journey, however, I caught a few indications of wildlife nearby, but they had long since fled upon my arrival. Eventually, the bright sun overhead grew dimmer and dimmer as I kept walking. I knew it would be far too dark to hunt soon, so instead, I began searching for a spot to set up camp. After hiking for a few more minutes, I came across a flat area. It seemed like a good place to set up for the night. I unhooked my tent from my pack and began setting it up. Being a one-person tent, it didn't take very long. While I still had a little bit of daylight left, I gathered up some twigs and branches that I could and built myself a small fire just outside of my tent. Not necessarily for keeping warm, but more to keep the insects away. Once I had a fire going, I started to relax, sitting just outside of my tent, taking in my surroundings more intently. There is this feeling that is present when you're in the wilderness by yourself, of peace and quiet. On the other hand, there is also an ever-present danger as well. I try not to think of the latter as I got ready to go to sleep. About 3 hours after I had fallen asleep, I was awoken by a noise nearby. It was the cracking of twigs and the rustling of grass. I cracked an eye open, trying to remain as still as possible, but it was hard to discern what had caused the noise in the first place. I listened close as my sluggish mind became sharper. The faint noise grew louder and louder as it approached my tent. The smell of my campfire filled the air around me. I wonder if it was a bear, curiously wandering about. If that were the case, I didn't want to make any sudden movements. Either way, I waited for around 10 minutes, listening intently for any more sounds, but I didn't hear anything else. After a few more moments of silence, I began to get back into my sleeping bag, and I was once again on the edge of falling asleep. But then, another broken twig forced my eyes open again. I was just about to get up and poke my head outside of the tent when I heard something else. A voice in the darkness. It sounded like a child, a small boy, and it simply said, "Hello." Even though I wasn't moving, I felt my body tense up. Another step sounded outside of the tent, and the voice repeated once more, "Hello? Hello?" This time I noticed something very off-putting about the greeting. Apart from the fact that there might have been a child in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, in the middle of the night. The thing that was off-putting was that the hellos were perfectly identical, almost like it was a recording of some kind. When I heard it, I grabbed my rifle, which was lying next to me, and I gripped it tightly. After another moment, I could hear faint breathing coming from the other side of my tent. The voice sounded a third time, and when it did, I immediately sat up in my tent, trying to make as little noise as possible, and I readied my rifle at the direction of the voice. I could feel sweat beginning to drip down and sting my eyes as I tried to remain calm. I tried to think of a response to this voice, and I could only manage to say, "Who's there?" As soon as those words left my mouth, dark claws dug into my tent. The violent sound of tearing fabric filled the tent. Through the newly formed holes, I saw what was making that noise, and it definitely wasn't a child. Its skin was a darkened ash, and its eyes were a stark white. Its head was completely bald, but was covered in multiple pockmarks and scratches. A jaw hung slack with slime dripping from it. Upon seeing this thing, my brain only repeated one single word over and over again, a word which I hadn't used in fear since I was a child. Monster. My shaking hand squeezed the trigger, and a ring filled my ears. I couldn't hear anything, but I could see whatever it was stumble backward and collapse under the ground. As the ringing faded in and out, I could hear this thing coughing and wheezing violently. I scrambled to my feet and racked the bolt on my rifle as I forced my way out of what was left of my tent, ready to finish it off. But it was gone. I fearfully scanned the area, keeping my eyes peeled. There was no sign of the creature aside from a small pool of blood in the dirt nearby. I stepped back into my tent and gathered up everything as fast as I could, before quickly making my way back towards my truck. The thought of me not making it out of the woods alive crossed my mind plenty of times as I jogged. Lucky for me, after only an hour of moving through the woods, the faint light of the sun began cresting on the horizon. It was enough to make my journey back a little bit easier. I found my truck and drove out of the woods like a bat out of hell, and made it home soon after. When I got home, I told my mother that I had been unsuccessful in my hunting. She thanked me for trying regardless. My father chimed in from the couch, saying that it would have been different if he had been there. And that might have been true. Even though my father had been injured at his job, I take it as a blessing. A blessing that he won't be going hunting again for a very long time. As for me, well, I don't plan on ever going back into the Alaskan wilderness anytime soon. And if any of you out there are planning a trip, I would highly advise against it. There's something evil living out there in those woods. Something you don't ever want to see for yourself. My name is David Hernandez, and what I'm gonna share with you is the most terrifying experience I have ever lived. This story happened a few years ago. At that time, I lived in a place called San Jose Paso Nuevo, very close to the Cofre de Perote, in a very small town with only a few houses, and it's very quiet. Unfortunately, in this place, I lived through a terrifying experience, one that has to do with an encounter with a nahual. For several months, many people began to report that their animals were disappearing. There was no logical explanation, because even animals disappear during the day. This was a very serious situation, because as I mentioned, it's a fairly poor area. Losing an animal means losing a lot of money. People gather in the classroom of Don Agustin, the oldest man in the town. They began to organize to deal with all this. Some people thought it was someone from a nearby community, intending to take the animals, while others thought it was a coyote from the area. Fed up with the situation, people started to stand guard at night near the pens to catch the culprit. The first few nights, the men who stood guard swear that something made them fall deeply asleep. When they woke up, they realized that the 2 pigs were missing. Angry and upset, they began to count the lost animals in the village, and realized that a total of 52 were missing. The most affected by the situation was a man by the name of Humberto. This man had lost about 35 animals from his property, which was near the town limits by the mountain. This led people to think that maybe it was some sort of predator from the Cofre de Perote attacking the poor animals. To confirm this theory, there was the testimony of Humberto's wife. The lady recounted that one night, she went out because she heard the dogs barking. She walked around carefully and realized that a strange creature was on top of the perimeter fence. This was unlikely because the fence was almost 3 meters high, but this animal was on top and seemed to be some sort of dog. When the lady approached it, the animal jumped and ran off into the darkness. The lady told the story to the people of the town, and her husband offered a large sum of money to whoever kills this beast. My family was always short of money, so I was one of those who volunteered to stand guard on his property. That night, at around 1:30 in the morning, We were watching the goat pen because it seemed that those animals were more like. The pen was made out of stone with adobe, and we were just behind it. Soon, some of our companions fell asleep, and we didn't know how it happened. We were talking and out of nowhere, they just fell asleep. Those of us who were awake began to hear a strange noise, and we decided to prepare the weapons because we had confirmed that it was just a coyote. Maybe this was the reason why everyone else fell asleep, because in my town, it is said that these animals have some kind of witchcraft power. We were getting ready to face one, or maybe several coyotes, but we were not ready to face whatever it was that appeared before us. We heard heavy footsteps, and they were gradually getting closer. It was near, and that's when we saw it. A huge creature, gray in color. It was crouching just in front of the pen. I can't explain it. This animal was maybe about 1.5 meters tall in that position, and just when we thought that its size was incredible, we were in for another big surprise. The thing stood up, and its eyes were completely white. It had only one ear and a very slack jaw. Its fangs were visible, even more so with that ugly mouth, and it looked extremely thin with fairly short fur and claws about 10 or 15 centimeters long. We didn't know what to do, and we had heard stories of nahuales from our grandparents, but it had been years since such a creature had manifested in this area. I couldn't believe a single finger. I was paralyzed with fear, just like everybody else. It stared at us for about 5 minutes, and I swear, those minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, after being completely still, the creature began to move its head up and down. In a matter of seconds, it leaped into the pen, and that made us react, so we got ready to shoot it, but all of our guns jammed. This creature lifted 2 goats and ran off. We reacted a few seconds later and started the pursuit. We were guided by the sound emitted by the goats, and the creature was headed towards the Cofre de Perote. Some of us ran while others went on horseback. Obviously, the latter group got there first. They arrived where the trail disappeared, and we arrived about 30 minutes later. Those who were already there told us that the strange creature had entered a cave about 10 meters away. I don't think anyone in the town knew of its location, because if it weren't for this situation, we would have never found the cave. We were guarding the entrance, but nothing happened. Hours passed, and it was dawn when those who had gone on horseback returned for Mr. Humberto. They told him what happened the previous night, and the priest of the town came down to the cave around 8 in the morning. He was told about the events of the previous night, and the priest blessed the place. As soon as he started blessing the place, we began to hear a man crying. The priest told us not to be tricked by it. It was a trick from the nahual. When the priest finished praying, that's when the loud screams joined by curses were heard. We ended up deciding to seal the entrance with rocks and place several protections that the town's priest gave us. We stood guard there for 2 more nights just to make sure that it didn't come out. And during that time, we heard the same howling several times. It seemed like an animal was trapped in the cave, and all we could hear was its desperate attempts to escape. A few days had passed, and a lady with a baby in her arms came looking for her husband. She was from a nearby town called Tonalco, and she said her husband hadn't come home for several days. The last time he left, he said he was going to San Jose Paso Nuevo to buy some animals. We didn't know what to tell her. We asked what her husband did, and she replied that he bought and sold animals. She confessed that their financial situation had improved only a few months ago because they were very poor. But since her husband started this business with a friend, things had been better for them. There was no doubt in anybody's mind that this man was the same nahual that had been stealing the animals. We told the lady that we didn't know anything about her husband. Sadly, she returned to her town, and from that day on, weird things started happening in the town. During the night times, people would hear weird noises. In the middle of the night, in the streets. They said they would see strange black birds perched on the roofs of the houses, and a horrible smell of rotting flesh in the early hours. To make matters worse, many people returning from work late at night would claim to see a man dressed in black walking towards that cave. The priest said that the man was the same one who came to visit his son after having experienced all this. I eventually decided to move, for I became very afraid, and every night I dreamed of that creature that I saw. I ended up asking for help from a relative who lives in Costa Rica, and he kindly let me live with him. From here, I share my story with you, and I swear, it's not a joke. If you visit the town of San Jose Paso Nuevo, you can hear the same exact story from the mouth of many people. I'm still freaking the fuck over what happened this last weekend. I think it's still out there. I fucking hope so. This all began a few months ago when I moved here from Eastern Washington to attend a university. I recently turned 21, but I didn't have any friends around to celebrate. So I did the next best thing, rolled a blunt, and ended up watching some stuff on Hulu. I'm living the life here. Recreational weed, undeclared major, living off my savings. And finally, no more parents nagging at my door to do something with my life. Or, at least I thought so. The first time I heard it, I thought I was paranoid. I smoke a ton of pot, and living in a new city doesn't help either. People say I live in the party area of downtown. Belltown, I think they call it. It just seems like an endless parade of people and drug street kids skulking at all times of night. And to be honest, it doesn't really bother me that much. I drown that shit out with headphones anyways. I much prefer it to that cold, deafening silence. The silence so strong you start realizing just how bad your situation actually is. A silence that conjures nightmare creatures from the deepest reaches of your mind to explain the occasional noise and the environment of a quiet house. It was in that silence that I heard it. I was grinding some bud for my third bowl of the night when I noticed the empty quiet that filled the space outside of my apartment. I'm on the ground floor, so I'm basically used to all types of screaming, singing, arguing, and fighting when the sun goes down. But not now. Not tonight. There was nothing. It came from the window in my quote-unquote kitchen, because it's literally 2 burners and a mini fridge with a microwave on top. Despite what you know or think about stoner stereotypes, I'm pretty fucking immaculate when it comes to cleaning too. That's why I was puzzled when I investigated the sound. Small amounts of dirt speckle across the small excuse for a counter under the window. The window was closed. I cleaned off the counter and figured I was too high to remember making that mess earlier. Fear was overcome by a wave of relaxation when I hit my pipe. Purple Kush. Family Guy eased me into a coma, and by the morning, I didn't even bother thinking about the noise from the night before. But from then on, it kept happening. Night after night, after night. The same 3. Always at different times too. 1 o'clock, 2:45, 1:37, 3:40. There wasn't really a pattern to it, just the same weird interval of scratches. It seemed to be getting faster every time. I just started assuming it was someone fucking with me. Maybe some guys picked a place to fuck with every night after they left the bar, and I just happened to get lucky. This explanation would actually help me calm down, and I was eventually convinced that this was all it was. I still didn't have any friends here, and with the cold snap and rain, I didn't really feel like going out and making any yet. The school semester was almost over, and I noticed that I wasn't getting enough sleep. The scratching was getting louder now, and joke or not, I had to get some rest before finals week. One of my classmates suggested going camping. She even offered to let me use her tent and sleeping bag. She said that getting out of the city once in a while and being in nature helps calm the mind. Kinda hippie sounding, but I was stoned when she said it. I took up the offer and made a reservation at the campground. I'm not gonna mention where at, because it might still be down there, waiting for someone. The girl from my class met me at a Starbucks downtown and gave me her camping gear. I really appreciated the kindness, but I'm not sure if my high as fuck monotone voice and glossy red eyes convey any evidence of that. Didn't matter anyways. I packed a couple grams of bud, my pipe, and my old camera. I got inspired by all the Milky Way pictures that people post online, and sleep or not, that was my mission now. The trip out to the park was long. I saw maybe one gas station for 20 miles, and I ate my snacks on the way there. I stopped there to re-up the trail mix and Cliff Bars and Muscle Milks before I continue on my way. The clerk looked Native American, kinda old too. He had this weird look in his eyes when I approached him, as if he was about to say something but cut himself off, and silently rang up my tasty treats. It was his eyes though that bothered me. He had this look of sympathy and dread and sadness, all in one. Maybe I was analyzing the situation too hard, but it seemed like he wanted to tell me something. Whatever though, I had a galaxy to photograph. The campsite was okay. I pitched the tent fast even though some of the poles were missing and didn't snap all the way. I took a hit off my pipe and looked up at the sky, camera in hand ready to snap that winning Milky Way shot. Clouds. Nothing but a fucking gray sky. Too tired to drive, I got in the tent and listened to a podcast from my phone speakers. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I did, eventually. And then, I woke up. It was scratching at the fucking tent. Get the fuck off my tent, douchebags. And again, I was met with that cold silence. No one responded. I was somewhat paralyzed from fear, but in that brief moment, I checked my phone to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I refreshed the news app and saw it update in real time. Kind of a dumb way to check that everything is okay. But I guess it doesn't matter when... All around the tent, I heard it scratching and scratching to a point where I thought I was just going insane. My heart pounded out of my chest, and my anxiety was at the highest point it's ever been my entire life. Each passing moment of silence felt like another calm to a storm of horror. The scratching in my imagination. I couldn't get out of the tent. I couldn't speak. I waited and waited. It continued, scratching faster and faster, and suddenly, I heard something. My tent. My... The way it spoke. Definitely not normal sounding for a person. The fact I was even questioning the humanity in its voice was reason enough to piss myself, which I did. For a grown-ass man, I was on the verge of tears. This was too much. I grabbed my car keys and phone, and weed, and unzipped the front flap. I bolted to the car, not looking back as I ran. The keys fumbled around the lock and I could hear something behind me. Turning. It sounded huge, but it sounded like it was on 2 feet. The key slid in, and that's when I remember I had a clicker. It was in this moment of dumb realization. I got the ignition started, turned the high beams on, and reversed out of my spot to hightail it out of the camp. Nothing in front of me. I peeked the rear view mirror before hitting the gas, only to see 2 long, hair-covered legs, lit up by my brake lights, making giant strides towards my rear window. I stomped on the pedal, whatever it was trying to catch up to me, but it gave up after I approached about 60 miles per hour. The drive back was a relief, and a part of me still could not believe what happened. When I got home, it was already morning. The sun was up, and I could see people staggering back from bars and nightclubs. It was a moment of relief. I felt a little back to normal until I got out of the car to get the supplies. Huge gashes were scratched into the window and door, and my tailpipe was slightly bent. At least I'm not crazy, I thought. I lifted up the rear hatch, and that's when I realized I forgot that I abandoned that girl's camping gear out in the campsite. My stomach dropped. There's no way she would believe my story. But that's when I noticed something else in the back seat of my car. Dirt. Small mounts of it speckle across the floor and seats. I'm writing this from home, and as an update, it's 4:53 p.m. And I just want to let y'all know, it's back. I have talked about my road trip on here before. I took the first vacation of my life last year. A rebuilt Yamaha and a foolish sense of optimism carried me across the western United States. Being adventurous seriously made me rethink everything I thought I knew about the world. I love Seattle with the hip original hippie neighborhoods and the carnival atmosphere of Pike Place Market. Getting out of Seattle was a total nightmare. Restricted to back roads by a motor that capped at 40 miles an hour, I must have gotten lost a dozen times, despite all the help I received from baffled gas station attendants. So I was behind schedule when it came to finding my campsite. Some miles south and a little east of the city, there's a free campground. It's most often used by horse riders. And boy, can you smell it. That's actually what guided me in the last few miles. There's a gravel road off the service road, and then a few crooked unpaved roads off of that. The trail markers were all bent, broken, or faded. In the end, I had to follow my nose. I set up my junior scout tent in the fading twilight. Mine was the only one there. I had the place all to myself. After a quick meal of apples from a previous campground, I did my travel log on my video camera before turning in for the night. I'm not sure how long I slept. I know I checked the time, but I can't recall what it was. Something had disturbed my well-earned beauty rest, but I was too groggy to remember what it was. That's when I sat up, too alert to fall back asleep, but too sleepy to be totally awake. That's when something brushed the side of my tent, and suddenly, I was more awake now than I had ever been. I had done plenty of camping by that point. I was familiar with the sounds of the nighttime critters, from raccoons to coyotes. Nothing had ever bothered me in my tent before, just snuffle around camp before wandering off and leaving me be. From the sound of the footsteps, it was walking on two legs. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion: a bear. There's a lot of conflicting information out there about how to deal with bears, and a lot of it depends on the type of bear. Sitting there in the dark with my heart beating in my throat, I had no way of telling what kind I was dealing with. Should I shout out or play dead? I was about 30 yards from a sturdy cement block outhouse that might be better shelter. As quietly as I dared, I slipped my boots on and got ready to dash. The zipper of the tent seemed impossibly loud in the night as I worked it slowly and slowly. After getting it to be fully open, I slowly went outside. Once outside, I craned my neck around to see if the bear, if that's what it was between me and the outhouse. With the incredible illumination of the Milky Way, I could see the campground clearly all the way to the tree line. There was nothing out there. However, I had this feeling that something was watching me. It was like feeling an insect crawl along the back of my neck. There was no logical way for me to know that something had its eyes on me out there in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, all alone. I couldn't dismiss it. Still on high alert, I crept along and tried not to crunch the gravel under my feet too loud. The outhouse was still my best bet. The door was propped open by a stone, but inside there was a heavy-duty bolt lock.
I would have to spend the night surrounded by the smell of not only horse, but also human poop. But I figured that was a fair trade for not getting killed or eaten. My hand was on the latch when I heard the awful crunch of footsteps and gravel behind me. I kicked the stone propping the door open out of the way and slammed the heavy metal door shut, no longer caring how much noise I made. Whatever was on the other side had fingers. Something tugged on the door as I struggled to bolt it shut. I won, but it was close. There was a metal mesh along the top of the outhouse for ventilation. Through the top, I could hear the heavy breathing that matched my own. My phone was back in my tent because I'm an idiot. There was no way to tell time. That's when the same stupid impulse that brought me out there in the first place kicked in. I had to know. Hello? Silence. Maybe this person didn't hear me. But then, hello? I could have shit myself. I was in the right place for it. The voice sounded like my own, and the sound of it was a kick to the gut. I couldn't even tell you why it made me so uneasy. The sensation was like when you're walking upstairs and you're expecting another step, but your foot comes down on an empty space. I'm sorry. I thought I was alone, I said. I am alone. Every syllable was off. Hey, I'm sorry, I freaked out. I didn't think there was anyone else out here. Sorry, I'm here. You would think that if I knew it was another camper, I would have opened the door, but I never did. Some deeply buried instinct kept me from taking my hand off the bolt. Hey, you scared the crap out of me. Are there more tent sites out in the trees or something? I am something. There are more. The words made me sick to my stomach. Again, I couldn't have even told you why, only that they did. And from its odd speech, I guess English wasn't his first language. Do you need to go? Use the bathroom, I mean? Because I'm going to be in here for a while. That wasn't a lie. I wouldn't even open the door if it was my own mother on the other side. You need to go. Its English was improving with every sentence. There was something weird about that. Hey, look, I'm sorry if I scared you, but you started it by creeping around in the dark. I'm not gonna come out. Can you go somewhere else? I'll be gone in the morning, I promise. I just wanted to sleep in peace. You need to be gone.
I promise you, I creep in the dark. You won't be here in the morning.
Fear closed my mouth shut. The more I spoke, the more he did, and I didn't want to hear his voice anymore. I'm sure that made me sound like a bigot or something, but I had the feeling I was feeding words to him, and the feeling was not pleasant. It felt like he was hungry for them. The same instinct that told me to keep quiet the first time kept me from running my dumb mouth off again. I was dealing with someone who was not mentally well, or was something else. The way he was speaking, and the way his words were coming out, and the tone and voice, there was no doubt that he was going to carry out what he was saying. I kept my hands on the bolt, while they cramped on the first rays of sun crept through the mesh at the top of the walls of my shelter. It wasn't until the sun was strong enough to make me sweat in my self-imposed prison that I felt brave, stupid, enough to speak again. Hey, are you still out there? Hello? Anyone? There was no answer, which was the best outcome I could hope for. I opened the door. My tent was untouched, at least from a distance. The oppressive feeling of being watched had dissipated. I dressed and broke down camp in record time. My moped cranked to life, but it wasn't until I went to put my helmet on that I saw the footprint. I had kicked that rock pretty far. It was close to my bike. Naturally, I went over to it. I had to know. In a clear outline of fresh mud, there was a single print on the smooth gray of the stone. Not human, but a hoof like that of a horse or goat. It was so fresh, so vivid. It hadn't been there last night when I used the bathroom before I gone to bed. and the soft mud in front of the outhouse door were more of the same, some of them on top of my own boot prints. If you want to go looking for whatever the hell it was, be my guest. Just be careful with your words out there, because I figured out what was wrong with that voice when I watched the playback of my travel log video. It was my own. I'm pretty new to this, but I just have to get this out there. I have to tell someone about this, and I felt like this was the best place to tell people. This all started when I used to live in a small town in Arkansas, with a population around 5,000 plus people. It was a typical average, conservative town. In the summers it was hot and humid, and in the winter it was dark and cold. I grew up on southern entertainment, driving four-wheelers, and hunting every deer season, and maybe some small trapping here and there. But this happened during my last year of high school. I was 17 at the time. I had a girlfriend, lots of friends, and a shabby 1972 Ford pickup that I still have to this day. Anyways, it was November. Rifle season had just started, and I had been getting ready for it. My friend, his name is Drew, and I had been planning this trip for months, and we had everything ready. It was Friday, the end of the week, and the start of the weekend. Our plan was to hike up through the national forest, onto the mountain and set up camp and just have a good time. I wish I could have done something to have stopped myself. I woke up at 3 in the morning, leaving a note for my parents, and putting my things in the bed of my truck. I hopped in and drove to my friend's house. He was already waiting for me outside. I got out and said in a whisper, "You have all your things? I don't want to forget anything." "Yeah, I checked again before you got here," he said. He put his bag in my bed and put his gun in the truck, and we took off to the mountain. I had my eyes fixed on the road, and Drew was sitting there with a metal click. And I looked over and he was flicking a lighter on and off. "What's that?" I said, putting my eyes back on the road. "Oh, it's my grandfather's lighter. He had it with him all throughout the war." We then turned and went through the entrance to the hiking site. The change from road to dirt was just as familiar as ever. We stopped and got out. We put on our bags and headed up the mountain trails. It was around 7 and we could see where we were going because the sun was coming over the trees. The birds were chirping and I could see the squirrels running through the trees chattering. 3 hours of hiking later, we came up the campsite that we followed with our map. When we got there, we quickly set up our tarps, and we were quick to find firewood and to start a fire. I told my friend that I would get us some lunch, and I headed off with my rifle to go get something to eat. I walked for at least half a mile south, and found myself breaking the tree line. I decided I would sit and watch for a bit. I sat underneath a large oak tree, and looked for any movement. The sun was rising slowly. I was sitting there when all the birds stopped for a moment. The silence was deafening. The sharp ringing in my ear was eerie. I scanned slowly with my eyes only, staying as still as possible. That's when I saw movement across the field. It was hard to make out. I slowly raised my rifle and looked down the hill. A deer had poked its head out of the tree line. I only saw its head and neck from where I was at. I knew it was risky to take a shot, but I also knew I wouldn't have another chance to bag another deer. Regardless, it was a doe anyhow. That's when I noticed something. The deer's head was higher off the ground than most deer should be. I felt like it was watching me. It slowly turned to the left. I could only see its neck and shoulders, and I could hear leaves crunching as it moved deep into the dark forest. A little nervous, I decided to head back to camp. I followed the mental landmarks that I saw the first time. A tree that had fell over, dried up creek bed, and I could see the tarps in the distance through the trees. When I got back to the campsite, we decided it was time to catch up on some sleep. I crawled into my tent and got in my sleeping bag and fell asleep. We got up early that morning. It was still as eerie as it was the day before. It just felt so weird, different. No animals in the area, just silence. It was strange. The air felt heavy. There were no birds anywhere, no deer, rabbits, or anything. Not even any crows crying out. We were getting hungry, and when the sun set, we nestled down waiting for some game to come around. It soon grew dark again, and we decided to come together and to make some beans that I had packed just in case we didn't catch anything. As we were getting everything ready, my friend Drew got up from his seat and said, "I'll be right back. I gotta take a piss." I sat there drinking my water, watching the fire dance. And after some time, I noticed that Drew had been gone for a while. That's when I started to get concerned, and I heard leaves crunching, and I jumped and looked towards where the sound came from, and it was Drew. However, his face was pale. "Dude, come over here," he said. "What's over there? Just come over here and look," Drew said as I got up to follow him into the darkness of the forest. As I was walking, I started smelling something horrible, something pungent, and it got stronger and stronger as we walked deeper into the woods. The smell was so bad, and then, as I was walking, something fell on my shoulder. I turned my head to see what it was, but the smell of death made my stomach churn. I leaned over and started to throw up, while this thing that was on my shoulder fell to the floor. It hit the ground with a sickening, squishy sound. I pulled out my light and pointed it to the ground. I got confused for a second when a drop of blood fell on my hand. I looked up and my heart skipped a beat. What I saw was disturbing. The guts of an animal, limbs, pieces. A squirrel that had been impaled on a branch. What was left of it, at least. I looked at the face of Drew, still drained of all color. His mouth was open, eyes wide. "Dude, what the fuck?" I said. And that's when we just ran and bolted back to the campsite. How did they get up that high in the tree? Why were they on the branches? "Maybe we should leave," I said. "I agree. I don't want to stay here anymore, man," Drew said. We started shoving our food and things back into the trail packs. That's when we heard crunching a few yards away from us in the pitch black darkness of the forest. Drew aimed his shotgun at the sound, and I slowly raised my rifle. I pulled out the mag light and pointed it to where we heard the sound. We were about 8 yards away from where we heard it. I flicked on the flashlight, and a deer was leaning, its head out beside a tree next to some brush. With some relief, we lowered our guns, and that's when the deer suddenly fell to the floor. The deer's head rolled down the hill and stopped in front of us. Something had ripped or chewed the deer's head off and rolled it down the hill. But that wasn't the reason I was scared. Someone had been holding the deer's head. And then everything clicked. The bones, the guts, and other miscellaneous parts of animals hanging on the dead tree branches. And that's when I looked up, and a grotesque, elongated hand came from around the tree. We bolted down the hill. I didn't care about our stuff. They could be replaced. We faced in and out of running and jogging. We had our lights and we were looking for a landmark. Anything. Something. That's when I remembered that before we came to the trail, there was a big sign with the words, Washita National Forest. I made that a point in my mind and looked around for it with my eyes. My lungs were burning. My legs were in pain, but I kept running. I would glance back and check on Drew and how close he is behind me. I turned off my flashlight, and so did Drew. We laid up against a tree, still as possible. I could see the breath of Drew, frozen in the moonlight. My eyes finally adjusted to the dark, and I looked over at Drew and turned on my light. An arm long and bony, covered in blood. It sank its nails into the shoulder of Drew. Immediately, blood started spewing out. He started screaming in pain, and he was lifted up, screaming louder and more painfully. He was slammed on the ground. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. He was dragged through the forest, screaming, taking shots with his shotgun. With every shot I could see his silhouette, moving further and further into the woods. I ran. I just kept running, and that's when I tripped over something, and I started falling down the rest of the hill. I slammed up against a tree. I stopped and my back was in pain. I realized it was quiet again. There were no crickets. Nothing. Just silence. My eyes already adjusted to the darkness. I could see through the woods. In the distance, the moonlight was shining through the trees. I lay still as possible, and then I heard some shuffling, and I saw that thing moving through the woods. It was strange, jagged, and tense. I can't even describe it. It just felt wrong. It was tall and thin. Its bones were rubbing up against its skin. It seemed very malnourished. It shifted back and forth as if it was looking for something. When it turned its face, the grace of the moonlight revealed its features. It was disturbing. It had an elongated chin and small eyes, dark folds of skin around them. The skin was darkish gray. Its mouth was large. It spread all the way across its face. It had its teeth jagged and broken. Its mouth and nose was covered in blood and also in chunks of meat. The blood trailed down and covered its torso. I was about 10 yards away from it, and it crawled on all fours. It started to come towards me. Closer and closer. I could smell it. It smelled like roadkill. That's when I threw up in my mouth and held my breath. My hope at this point was that my death would come quickly. I still had some hope that I would make it out alive. But suddenly, this thing started speaking.
James, James, James.
In the most ungodly voice I ever fucking heard. The part that made my hope disappear was when it started saying my name in my friend's voice. James.
James, James.
It wasn't just like his. It had two tones, one deep, and the other, my friend's voice. It kept saying this and it crawled away through the woods, back up the hill. I stayed there for I don't know how long. I cried silently, and for some reason, I started moving my hand around, and I found something. It was cold and rectangular. I looked closer. It was the lighter that belonged to Drew, and my flashlight had broken on my fall. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bag. I turned and slung it into the woods and ran towards the parking lot. It started screaming my name, but this time, it sounded demonic. This time it was no longer my friend's voice. I kept running and I didn't recognize anything. I flicked the lighter of Drew and scanned the area. My hand ended up hitting something. It was a sign, and with the lighter I read, National Forest. I looked back and heard that same screech, and I ran through the tree line. At a distance I saw my truck. I ran as much as I could, and when I got there I flung the door open and jumped into my truck and started it. I flipped my gears, pulled out, and hit the gas flying out of that parking lot. As I drove, I looked back, and God, I wish I hadn't looked back. It had broken the tree line, and it noticed me driving away. It stopped in the light of the parking lot, now shown in detail. It fucking stood tall. It was at least 9 or 10 feet tall, and its face, I'll never get that picture out of my head. It looked angry, and its eyes were full of hate, and what I assumed at the moment, hungry. I put the pedal to the floor. I tore off the side road and onto the highway. I looked at myself. My jacket was torn and ripped. I was covered in dirt and had cuts and scrapes everywhere. I pulled up to the police station, and according to what information I had gotten, it took a while for the cops to stop me from screaming about that it had killed Drew. A bunch of men got together the next day and rounded up a search party, with the sheriff leading the search. I ended up refusing to go. They scaled through the mountain and searched for my friend. It was nighttime when they found him. He was barely recognizable, they said. They found him under a log. His eyes had been ripped out. His tongue was forcefully pulled out. His arms and legs had been mauled. He had been gutted, and his genitals had been cut off. And his face, they told me his face was scratched and seemed to have been chewed down to the bones. And his neck had been broken in so many places. I can't even express through here how terrible I feel for running and not trying to help him. I still remember his tears streaming down his face before he was dragged away from me. On paper it was reported as a bear attack. After the incident, my grandfather came and talked to me. He said, "I'm so sorry about what happened to your friend. All the people in my town know the existence of that theme. I heard countless stories of local hunters that have came across it." It's been about 8 years. I'm 25 now. There is not a day that passes that I don't think of my friend. He was my best friend. I'll leave you with this warning. If you ever go camping, be careful and keep yourself armed. I never want something like this to happen to anyone. I don't even wish that experience on my worst enemy. However, I still go hunting to this day, but I warn you, never go into the woods in Arkansas. During winter, you may just find something out there that you don't want to find. And it may just be a mental thing, but sometimes at night, when it's really quiet, I can hear my friend calling my name. Hey everyone, I'm a huge fan of all scary things, and even the unexplained. I even have my own YouTube channel where I post interviews that I have done with people who have experienced any sort of paranormal activity. However, there is one thing that I've always been, well, quite a skeptic about, and that is skinwalkers. I mean, witches who transform into animals, and apparently are only confined to a specific area within America. To me, it always sounded like the typical legends and stories about the boogeyman, that parents tell you about. However, there are some events that have been happening that have actually made me doubt everything. And now I'm sharing this story so that you all can avoid what I did, and also see if anyone out there can actually help me. My friend Zanny is of Navajo descent. He always shared cultural insights and stories of the res with me. It was during one of our discussions over text that he first introduced me to the legends of the skinwalkers. He said something about shape-shifting humans, and with curiosity, I gladly accepted his invite to visit the res. Being a YouTuber or media creator, I plan to stay for a week, hoping to go deeper into these stories, do some research, capture photos of notable sites, and gather first-hand accounts from the locals. The res was unlike any place I've been to. With its landscapes perfect for photos, it was both beautiful and eerie. Over the first few days, I kept finding myself busy, from visiting the local trading post, hanging out at community events. I learned about their daily lives, taking photos and setting up casual interviews with all sorts of people and the locals about these so-called skinwalkers. However, of course, the people of the res met my questions about skinwalkers with different reactions. Some would actually cast their eyes downward, offering nothing more than a no comment. Others stared back with a stern look, warning me of the consequences of prying too deep into the things that are best left alone. Yet, a few brave souls did share stories about so-called coyotes who transform into humans. Apparently, they can mimic certain voices and animal sounds. How one should not whistle at night, as it's believed that this might actually invite or summon a skinwalker. So during my time there, I stayed in a hogan that belonged to Sandy's grandma, but at the moment nobody was staying in it, except for Sandy. For those unfamiliar, a hogan is a traditional Navajo dwelling place constructed from a mixture of logs. There's actually some spiritual significance for the Navajo. It's almost like you can feel a connection to the land, and the door to the hogan always faces east to greet the morning sun, which apparently is important in their daily rituals and traditions. After my string of interviews and questions on the res, word seemed to have traveled fast. On the 5th day of my stay, I was outside the hogan trying to capture photos of the beautiful sunset when I noticed an older man approaching. He moved with a slow pace, and his clothing was traditional, and around his neck were hanging all sorts of amulets that were making noise with each step that he took. Zanny, who had been inside the hogan, stepped out and immediately went silent upon seeing this man. He whispered to me, "That's Tahoma, one of the respected medicine men around these parts." Before I could ask more, Tahoma was already within earshot, his piercing eyes set deep and locked with mine. "You're the one asking about those whom walk on all fours," he stated, more than asked. I hesitated for a moment, taken back by his statement. Yeah, I am," I admitted, extending my hand in greeting. "I'm just curious about the legends," and he ignored my hand, cutting me off with a stern, "Curiosity can lead to places from where there's no return." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I was trying to keep the conversation going. "Hey, no disrespect. I'm just here to learn more about the culture and the stories." Tahoma stared deep into my eyes, as if he was studying my words. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a grave tone. "There are things on this land that you don't understand, that you cannot comprehend with your questions and your cameras. You awaken things best left undisturbed." I gulped, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Hey man, I apologize if I offended or overstepped," I said. He leaned in closer, and with a hushed voice filled with urgency, he warned, "Leave this place. They have taken notice of you, and they don't like you watching them." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence. My friend, looking as pale as I felt, said, "When Tahoma speaks, we listen. I've been trying to tell you that these things are real, man." That night, the environment of the hogan felt different, more ominous if anything. Every small noise outside made me jump, and the once comfortable walls felt suffocating. I couldn't shake off the medicine man's warning, even though, to be honest, I didn't believe him. Despite the tension that hung in the air that night, a part of me still doubted most of these things. I hadn't personally witnessed any evidence of skinwalkers or the supernatural during my stay so far, and stories and legends were one thing, but tangible proof was another thing. The medicine man's warning, a little scary I will admit, could just be a way to dissuade outsiders like me from prying too deep into Navajo traditions, I thought. I'm not gonna lie, that night, all the skinwalker talk had me a bit on edge. I guess the fact of being out here kinda didn't help. I had to use the restroom, so I stepped out the hogan and walked towards the dimly lit outhouse. As I was sitting down, remembering that next time to not indulge in other cultural foods so quickly, the distant sounds of the wilderness were interrupted by other noises that I started to hear, which were soft footsteps, the rustle of brush nearby, and the quiet creak of shifting dirt. It felt as if someone or something was slowly circling the outhouse, each footstep sounding closer than the last. Drawing in a silent breath, I waited, heart pounding, straining my eyes to see any trace of movement through the small cracks in the wooden structure, but I didn't see anything. Then, a tap at the door. Keep in mind this was around 11 at night, so I said out loud, "Hey, I'm in here." No response. Then, I heard what sounded like perhaps a dog scampering away on all fours, with the running steps fading into the distance. Well, that was weird, I thought. As I finished up handling my business, I slowly unlatched the door and stepped out, cautiously scanning the darkness. I kid you not, as soon as I took 2-3 steps, from behind me, I felt a force clamp down on my shoulder, causing me to jump nearly out of my skin. That's when I turned around, and I saw it. The face of Zanny, with a roaring sound and then a loud laugh. Catching my breath and shaking my head, I said, "Well, alright, you got me, dude," I admitted. He started to laugh, throwing an arm around my shoulders as we began to walk back to the Hogan. "You have to admit," he began, sweeping an arm out and pointing to the landscape. "The rest is beautiful out here at night. Without the bright city lights, everything feels more alive, more connected." I took a moment to appreciate the beauty around us, the clear sky filled with numerous stars. "It's beautiful out here, Sanny, but I do want to let you know, it feels like we're the only ones out here. Some of these stories, legends, they just seem like traditions, to be honest, passed down to make sure that everybody respects the land." He looked at me, then nodded. "Well, that's fair, but some traditions are born from truth that has actually been forgotten," Sanny said as we continue our walk back to the Hogan. On my last night at the res, I decided to indulge in a bit of mischief and to get back at Zanny for the prank he pulled. While heading back from the outhouse again, I tiptoed around the Hogan, tapping gently on its walls and trying to mimic the eerie Skinwalker sounds I heard they made. I was hoping that maybe Zanny would start reciting a prayer that he told me that the people do whenever there's a Skinwalker around. I was waiting to see if Zanny came out when I noticed little bundles near the Hogan's base. With curiosity, I took out my phone and captured a few pictures, thinking it would add a unique touch to my video. And nearby, I saw stones, fixed in a way that seemed to be a ritual circle. I moved a few rocks to get a better picture. Then, laughing quietly to myself, and seeing that Zanny was not reacting to this, I began to whistle. And then, in a mocking demonic voice, I called out,
Zanny, it is I who walk on all fours.
There was only silence. And after about 5 more minutes, and seeing that he still wasn't coming, I decided to take some last final shots of the beautiful landscape, as I knew this was my last night there. When I finally returned inside, Zanny was there, snoring away. I chuckled to myself thinking, well, if a real Skinwalker ever shows up, you'll be of no help with that deep sleep. The next morning I said bye to Zanny and his grandma and thanked them for their hospitality. I also told Zanny I would contact him once I put a video together, and that before publishing, I would send it to him to make sure he was okay with it. When I returned home to edit some of the videos and pictures, I noticed that something was off. In the background of many interviews were shadows, flickering in and out of the frame. Even when I was trying to edit some of the interviews I had done, the audio itself sounded distorted, with what sounded like whispering echoes behind the words of those whom I interviewed. However, it was the pictures that really disturbed me. Every single image that I had taken, even in the daylight, had a faint shadow figure growing more and more clear with each picture. And the most scary picture was the last few that I took after rearranging those stones. The picture was supposed to be of the landscape, but instead there was a blurry silhouette of what looked to be a person. It had elongated limbs and also a twisted, unnatural posture. Nervously, I contacted Zanny, and after explaining everything, he went quiet, saying that he would ask the local medicine man for advice. The next day, Zanny called. His voice sounded worried. He told me I might have caught the attention of something, and that he's communicating with Tahoma, the medicine man, to perform a ceremony. They believe it might help cleanse whatever I had caught the attention of. That same night, as I was asleep in my room, I was awoken by what sounded like whistling outside my window. I woke up half asleep, and I swear, I heard a voice coming from my closet, saying, "I'm in here," mimicking my response that I gave when I was in the bathroom that night in the res. I'm posting this here because, out of all the places on the internet, I figure this community might be the most understanding. If anyone knows what I can do to make things right, or how to protect myself, please let me know. I will provide an update tomorrow once Annie tells me how the ceremony went. But please, take this serious. I'm starting to panic as I'm typing this. And I swear, every time I glance at the dim reflection on my PC, when I change a window or tab, that distorted, twisted figure from that last photo I took seems to be standing right behind me. Our annual camping trip was always a perfect time to get away from the daily busyness of life, a way to reconnect with nature and each other. It's something we had been doing since we had gotten out of high school. Every summer, my friends and I would choose a different, often remote location to explore and go camping. And so this summer, the 6 of us, Sarah, Mike, Jennifer, Luke, Emily, and I, decided to go further up north in Utah, into the Wasatch Cache National Forest. When the day finally arrived, we met at dawn. We had decided to take my beat-up old van that my father had given me as a graduation gift after high school, around 6 years or so. It was a family possession that was being passed down, so you can imagine what it looked like. I do gotta say, even though I was embarrassed about it at first, it is still running and getting me from point A to point B without any issues. It was spacious and had enough seats for all of us to ride together, even with all of our gear, which included all of our tents and camping stuff. The drive to the National Forest was beautiful, and it also had amazing views. The road stretched before us as hours passed, and the landscape shifted from small roads to being surrounded by dense trees. We shared stories, and the occasional debate about the best path to take to reach our destination. Sarah, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, looked at the map that she had spread out, her finger tracing the various roads they could take. "Alright folks, we got a couple of options here. The main road will take us through the heart of the forest, but this secondary road might offer a more scenic journey." Before venturing into the wooded pines of Utah, we stopped by one of the local forest offices to gather information. Google and iPhones couldn't always be relied upon in these remote areas, so Sarah had purchased a detailed local paper map. She was always the one planning every trip down in detail. I know we're used to having technology guide us, but out here, it's best to rely on good old-fashioned paper, she said, holding up the map with a grin. Mike, who was sitting behind me, leaned ahead, squinting at the map. "Scenic is good, but how well maintained is that secondary road? The last thing we want is to get stuck out here in the middle of nowhere." "Well, the map does say it's a bit longer, but it looks like it leads through some interesting landmarks. There's an old bridge marked here, and it seems like a more direct path to the campsite," Sarah said. Luke, who was sitting in the far back, raised an eyebrow with a grin. "An old bridge, huh? Are we talking wooden planks, or Indiana Jones style adventure?" Jennifer laughed. "Let's hope it's somewhere in between. I'm all for adventure, but I'd rather not end up in a river." Leo, As the driver, what do you think? Sarah asked me. Well, seeing that we still have sunlight on our side, I say we take the scenic road. I mean, what's the rush, right? I vote for the old bridge. I'm gonna say the old bridge as well. Why don't we take a vote? Emily said. Everyone raised their hand except Mike. Sorry, Mike. Maybe next time you'll win, Sarah said. A decision had been reached. The secondary road, with its promise of scenic beauty. I veered onto the road, the wilderness and trees closing in. The path was narrow, flanked by dense woods that only gave way to small rays of the sunlight. After hours had passed and the sun began to set, we found ourselves coming across the bridge that spanned the river, the water reflecting the fading light, a contrast to the woods that lay ahead. It looks like this is the old bridge Sarah mentioned, Mike remarked, as I slowed down the van. Sarah peered out of the window, her eyes scanning the bridge. It definitely has that rustic charm, but I hope it's sturdy enough to support the van. Luke's grin returned as he leaned, his excitement evident. Well, there's only one way to find out. Jennifer laughed. Alright, but if we end up in the river, Luke, you're swimming back to the campsite. I'm not gonna lie, I was nervous. The bridge looked like it was a mixture of concrete and wood. What if we didn't make it? When was the last time this bridge was used? I eased the van slowly onto the creaky bridge, not even knowing what the point of driving slowly was, because if it was to break, it was gonna break. The worn planks made noises beneath the weight of the van, as the river flowed gently below. I looked in the rearview mirror to see everyone's scared faces as we crossed, still maintaining my eyes on the road back and forth. I saw Emily's eyes as she gazed out the water below. This is something like an adventure out of a movie, isn't it? I'm expecting to see hidden treasure on the banks, she said. Mike chuckled, his grip steady on one of the handlebars. Yeah, you're right. We're gonna find out what adventure this is if we end up falling, because you all decided to come through this raggedy bridge. Mike was always the more serious one, but courageous in the group. He always took challenges head on, and nothing ever seemed to scare him. Luke was the joker of the group. His sense of humor was always there, even in the most serious moments. Sarah, on the other hand, was our friend who was the most caring of the group. As I said, she always assumed the role of our mom, always making sure everything is planned to the detail. Emily was just silly all around. She was a close friend of all of us, that we simply enjoyed her company. She was the most serious female of the group, but didn't have the seriousness of Mike. Well, if that even makes sense. We ended up making it across the bridge, which I do want to point out, it's not even a long bridge. It simply looked like a small construction bridge that someone built to be able to get across. As the sun started going down, we continued driving with the trees closing in around us even more, almost creating what looked like a tunnel, with the headlights of the van being the only source now piercing the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached our destination, a dirt open field that looked like where vehicles had parked in the past. Tall pine trees stood around the field, forming a natural dome that seemed to welcome us from the outside world. Alright everyone, this is it, I said as I parked the van and stepped out, the air carrying a smell that hinted at the adventures that awaited us. There was a small stream nearby, its gentle flowing of water adding to the nature that surrounded us. We unloaded everything and we walked a little bit deeper into the woods until we stumbled upon a clearing not too far from where we had parked. We began the process of setting up camp, pitching tents, arranging firewood, and establishing a central gathering point where the campfire would soon be set ablaze. As the sun finished dipping below the horizon, casting the area in complete darkness, the tent stood up and the campfire pit awaited. We were all fascinated by the beauty of this place, away from the busyness and the stresses of every day in our life. So the first night there started fine, but as the campfire flames flicker in the breeze, we huddle around the fire, sharing stories and laughing, with a sense of security over us, just because of the presence of each other. With the trees casting long shadows over our campsite, and the branches creaking softly in the night wind, our voices would rise and fall as we took turns recounting past stories and adventures. We talked the normal things when you hang out with friends and family, the same old stories from the past. Hey, remember that time Luke tripped over his own shoelaces and didn't have anything else to wear? Emily giggled, making fun of Luke. He chuckled and rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, I remember. And I'm still gonna say that the tree root came out of nowhere. Jennifer leaned in. Or what about that haunted house we dared each other to explore? I'm pretty sure we all had nightmares for weeks after that. Sarah with a smirk. Alright, but what about this, y'all? The time we heard those strange noises outside our tents during that camping trip in the mountains. Mike's face turned serious and said, Man, I thought we were being surrounded by wild animals or something. That's right, and then we found out it was just a bunch of raccoons having a party in the woods, I said. Of course, throughout this whole time, Emily couldn't say anything but laugh. The night continued on, and it was always a great time to gather with my friends, especially after not seeing them for so long. As we were telling and recounting past adventures, something caught my attention. I was looking over to Mike as he was talking, and for a quick glimpse, at the edge of the woods, where the firelight struggled to penetrate the darkness, there was movement, a flicker of shadow that seemed to move between the trees. I quickly stood up and focused with my head to look over towards the tree line, as I exchanged glances with the others. Did any of you see that? I whispered. Luke turned to look where I was looking and squinted into the darkness. What did you see? Maybe a deer or something? It moved kind of strange for a deer, I said. Jennifer leaned closer to the fire. I hope you're not trying to pull a prank, Leo. As I looked deeper into the tree line, still trying to get my eyes adjusted from staring at the fire for too long, I saw that the movement in the trees and branches was getting closer. It was something, or someone. I kept staring out into the tree line. This movement was drawing closer, slowly becoming visible by the light the fire was giving out. And that's when I noticed a silhouette of a hunched figure. And I guess that's when Luke finally saw it, because he said, It looks like a person. Do you think it's someone lost in the woods? Emily whispered. I hope it's not someone who's hurt, Sarah said, with concern in her voice. Luke chuckled. Well, if this person is hurt, they're sure moving better than I would be. Who even goes wandering around the woods at this hour? Emily said. At this point, all of us were standing, and that's when I decided to say, Who's out there? I yelled. Then, just as this silhouette became clear in the tree line, that's when a voice broke the silence.
Greetings, young ones.
This person said in a voice that held both wisdom and innocence. Emerging from the trees, I saw it was an older man.
Forgive my intrusion. I spied the glow of your campfire from afar, and was drawn hoping it wasn't a wildfire that I would have to put out. This land, you see, holds a history long forgotten by many.
His steps and his form, revealing his age not only in his slightly stooped posture, but also in the deep lines engraved on his face. It was as though he was an extension of the trees surrounding us. As he drew closer, the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest underscored the quiet intensity of the moment. Finally, he approached the campfire, revealing his full features as he introduced himself.
Pardon me, my name is Tog.
His voice, very old and raspy, with one of his eyes semi-shut, scars and years of life showing on his face. I offer a friendly smile. Hey, I'm Leo, and this is Luke, Sarah, Emily, Jennifer, and Mike. We didn't expect to have company out here. What brings you to these woods at this hour? He stared at us with his one eye.
The woods have always been my refuge, my sanctuary, my safe place. I come here to remember the old ways, to honor the native land that sustained my ancestors.
Native land? Jennifer questioned, her voice in a serious manner. The old man nodded. His gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Staring at them, he said,
Yes, this land was once home to my ancestors, and I have wandered these woods to honor their memory. But in all my years, it's very rare when I encounter fellow souls under these stars.
Mike leaned in, with curiosity but in a serious tone. So, what brought you here tonight? With a faint smile, Togue said,
Your fire, as I said before. But then I heard the laughing that echoed through the trees. It reminded me of times in the past where I shared, and bonds were forged around similar fires.
Are you telling us that you're camping out here too? Emily asked. Togue's chuckle was like the rustling leaves themselves.
Well, not quite. My old bones prefer the comforts of a proper bed, but I do find peace in these woods, even under the cover of night.
As the conversation flowed, Togue's words painted a picture of his relationship with the woods. The way he spoke, the stuff he was saying, seemed like he was one with the forest.
There is nothing like finding peace and comfort within your own self, and the beauty of nature. There are hidden trails that go through the forest, roads known only to those who have taken the time to listen to the whispers of the woods. Every rustle of leaves, every flowing stream, and every whisper of the wind carries echoes of the past.
His voice full of reverence of the woods.
Listen, the ancient wisdom of this land has much to teach, if one is willing to listen.
I'm not sure what it was, but the way he spoke and the way he looked seemed like he was just a hippie who loved the outdoors. Pretty harmless in my opinion. I took a step towards him and put my hand on his shoulder. Togue? Well, how do you spell your name? I asked. My name?
Well, that's the first time that somebody has ever asked me how to spell it. As I mentioned, I have a native background, so it's spelled T-A-O-G.
I figured that's how you spelled it. Just wanted to make sure. Well, Togue, we're sharing stories ourselves, and it seems you have quite a few to tell. Would you care to join our campfire? His eye glinted with appreciation.
I would be honored to, young man.
As he settled into a log near the fire, and we all sat down, his presence seemed to infuse the night with a deeper sense of connection. He started telling stories of the hidden trails, the forgotten stories, and the ancient wisdom that whispered through the leaves, blending with the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the trees. He spoke not just of the past, but of the living spirit of the woods, a spirit that resonated with each of us as we gathered around the fire. As he delved into his stories and what seemed to be a TED talk on how we need to respect the woods and nature, he told us how he comes into the forest to spend seasons, to honor his spiritual ancestors, how he owns a few remote cabins, and has learned to be self-sufficient just like his ancestors. However, one specific story caught the attention of all of us. He told the story of a supposed creature that haunted these very woods for generations. Then, his voice took on a somber tone, and even the crackling fire seemed to be quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath to listen.
The whispering goat,
he began, his words dripping with a mixture of reverence and dread,
is a creature of darkness, a shapeshifter that walks a fine line between man and beast. It has a twisted power, the ability to mimic the voices of those it encounters, drawing them into its trap.
As he detailed this supposed creature, our circle grew tense. I could see the eyes of everyone else that they were paying attention to this specific story. He then lowered his gaze, and his voice, almost a whisper, he said,
A few decades ago, my brother ventured into these woods, drawn by the whispers of familiar voices. As I was searching for him, I heard my own voice calling out to him, but It wasn't me. It was someone else calling out to him. That's when I think my brother believed he was responding to my call, but it was the whispering goat's deceit, and so he never returned, and I never found him. His fate, shrouded in mystery. I have carried the weight of that loss ever since, haunted by the knowledge that he may have fallen prey to the whispering goat.
A shiver crept down my spine as we all listened. When he concluded his tale, there was silence. Even the fire seemed to have absorbed the weight of his story as it started to go down. With a slow and crippled movement, struggling to get up, he rose from his seat, his eye meeting each of ours in turn.
I thank you all for allowing an old man to share his stories with you. But the night grows old, and it's time for me to return to the embrace of these ancient trees,
he said in a voice that contained gratitude and sorrow. As he stepped away from the fire, he turned around and said,
I almost forgot. Stay close,
he said in a warning voice,
and do not be swayed by the voices that you think you know.
The darkness seemed to cover him as he walked away, making him one with the shadows of the woods. It's almost like he was part of this landscape. We watched in silence as he receded into the darkness, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Even the noises of the forest seemed to hold its breath, a quiet reverence for the figure that had imparted both wisdom and a warning. And as the echoes of his footsteps crunching the leaves faded, the woods returned to their symphony of rustling leaves and distant whispers. A heavy silence fell within our group. Well, what the fuck was all that about? This hippie love-making tree hugger most likely has his tent somewhere out there and lives out here in the woods, Luke said. We tried shaking off the feeling, but I could tell that anxiety had filled everyone, thanks to the power of a supposed well-told ghost story. But as the night deepened, the campfire had dwindled to embers, and a thick blanket of darkness fell over the campsite. I do want to point out that whenever we went camping, we always either slept inside a tent or outside altogether by the campfire. I guess nothing like actually experiencing the beauty of nature. Tonight, we decided to all sleep in our sleeping bags around the dying campfire, as the events of the evening and the stories still linger in our heads. We all decided to go to sleep, and as I was falling asleep, in the dead of the night, that's when I heard it, a whisper that seemed to move through the air. It was a voice, soft and insistent, calling my name, Leo. I fully woke up. I sat up in my sleeping bag, with my senses on high alert, my eyes widened, scanning the darkness and everyone else laying down, the faint glimmer of dying embers offering little comfort. Did anybody hear that? I whispered, hoping to see if anyone around me was awake and heard. Mike, who was sleeping next to me, sat up and said in a groggy voice, hear what? Someone whispered my name. It sounded like you, Mike. Mike's expression shifted from grogginess to a growing sense of unease. That's not possible, Mike said, his eyes flickering to the dark woods that surrounded them. I was asleep. Jennifer then arose with a voice of mixture. Are you sure you didn't dream it, Leo? I know that we're all on edge after the story told by Toad. I haven't even gone to sleep. Every noise out here is making me stay awake. I know what I heard. It was right here in the camp, I said. Man, go to sleep, bro. You're hearing things now. Stop being such a wuss. There's nothing out here, Mike said. But then, just on the edge after Mike's last word, the faintest whisper, Leo. Everyone fell silent. The voice was real, undeniable, and it sounded like it was next to our campfire. We all looked to Mike. What? I didn't say anything. Mike said. Of course, it was complete darkness, so we couldn't even really see each other out there. So we all just huddled even closer with everyone else waking up groggy as well, and getting closer together too, seeking refuge in our shared presence. Okay, what's going on, y'all? I said. It's most likely that old Pawpaw trying to prank us. He's most likely out there with more people scaring campers, Mike said. Well, one of us should stand watch and just be on the lookout. It's already 4 a.m., and the sun will begin to rise in a few hours, I said. Of course, none of us ended up going back to sleep, and we all just stood awake with eyes wide open. The morning couldn't come soon enough. Seeing the daylight brought relief, but as we remember the night, others, including Luke, Sarah, and Emily, admitted hearing whispers as well, each in the voice of a different member of our group. We tried brushing it off as imagination, simply fueled by the stories that Tog was telling us last night. We got ready for the day, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shadows on the forest floor. Emily suggested that we take a hike along one of the nearby trails that's on the map. Maybe some fresh air and a change of scenery will help us relax, she said, her voice trying to sound hopeful. Mike and Luke exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity. I guess it wouldn't hurt to explore a bit. I'm sure it was that old man whispering our names out from the trees last night. If I find him, once we go out there, he's really gonna be looking like an old dead beat up tree. Thanks to stupid Leo for telling him our names, Mike said. Sorry guys, I seriously thought he was just an old hermit walking through, I chuckled. There have been times in the past when we became friends with other campers in our annual trips, and we all shared names, even phone numbers, to communicate in the future, so I actually didn't think too much of it. We set off on the trail, our footsteps breaking the silence of the woods, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in patches of gold. As we walked, our conversation gradually shifted from the events of the previous night to lighter topics, remembering old camping trips, sharing funny stories, and debating the best way to make s'mores. It was almost like the woods were allowing us a moment of peace, a chance to reconnect and find comfort in each other's company. Hours passed, and we eventually found ourselves in a small clearing by a small stream. The sun was beginning its descent. We took a break, sitting by the water's edge, dipping our fingers in the cool stream. Check this out, y'all, Luke said, his voice with a mixture of excitement. He pointed to the tree where patterns had been carved into the bark. Sarah stepped closer, her fingers tracing the carvings with a sense of wonder. It's like a message left behind, she said as her eyes traced the lines. As we looked around more, we discovered other things, small artifacts hanging from branches, crafted from natural materials, by sticks and stones, and even with symbols painted onto the stones. Hey, it's like the woods are trying to tell us something similar to what Togue said, Emily slightly giggled. Mike raised an eyebrow. Or maybe it's just people messing around in the woods, you know, leaving their mark. Luke nodded in agreement, and branches crafted into what looks like symbols. They could be signs that they communicated like this back in the day. I guess the stories that Togue was sharing with us last night really did prove that we were in the midst of Native American land, and all these symbols and sticks and stones we found only reinforced that belief. Who knows? We might be standing on ground that's witnessed generations. Maybe these woods have secrets that date back centuries, Jennifer said. Look guys, I get that this all seems interesting and everything, but let's not forget that we've been on these trips every year, and every time there's some sort of spooky tale or mysterious superstition that pops up. Remember the haunted lake we stumbled upon 2 years ago? Mike said. Emily chuckled, her eyes with amusement. The one with the vengeful water spirit that would drag people under if they swam too far out? Mike with a grin. Exactly. And what did we find? A perfectly serene lake where we spent a whole day swimming and goofing off. Luke chimed in, and don't forget the enchanted forest last year, where we were told that we would get lost if we ventured too far into the deep woods. Jennifer, with a laughing tone, said, "Right, we found a trail with signs pointing us to various landmarks." Sarah joined in, and let's not even talk about the cursed campground, where they said that we would have to ward off evil spirits to make it through the night. As everybody was laughing, Mike nodded, his point emphasized. "See y'all, it's always been a bit of fun and games, fueled by local legends. I'm not saying I don't appreciate the spooky environments, especially by the campfire, but come on y'all, this is just the same old stuff we have encountered before." Emily grinned in a sarcastic and playful tone. "So you're telling us you don't believe in any of this? Not even a tiny bit?" Mike shrugged. "I'm not saying I'm a complete non-believer, but I do think a lot of people exaggerate. Like, what are the odds that we stumble upon some mystical artifacts on this trip, right? Or a whispering goat?" Luke raised his eyebrows and said, "Maybe the woods are trying to prove you wrong, Mike." The back and forth continued with everybody, as Mike reminded us that we were all friends who had been through it all before. As the day transitioned into evening, we made our way back to the campsite. The sinking sun painted the sky orange and pink. We couldn't ignore the fact that another night was approaching. A night that, given recent events, filled us with a mix of anticipation and dread. Back at the campsite, we set up and got dinner ready. The campfire crackled to life, with its flames dancing, and the forest too seemed to come alive with the chorus of all the critters starting to make noises. As darkness settled over the campsite, we gathered around the campfire once again. The events of the previous nights were still fresh in our minds. As the evening went on, a thick fog started to surround the entire campsite, and as our campfire struggled, its light barely puncturing the fog, Mike, always the brave one, volunteered to gather more firewood. He ventured out into the mist, his flashlight beam gradually merging with the surroundings. This is when everything went to hell. As the fog started getting more thick, and it was getting even more darker, we realized that Mike had been gone for a while. The minutes felt like hours. We exchanged glances. "He's been gone for quite a while, y'all. Shouldn't he have been back by now?" Emily said with a concerned voice. "Maybe he got lost in the fog. One of us should have gone with him," Luke said. Jennifer's eyes were wide. "What if he's hurt? What if he encounters something out there?" After about 30 minutes, the environment grew heavy. The campfire's embers started to sputter. The fog had taken on an almost suffocating presence. "Maybe we should go find him. We can't just wait here in the dark," Sarah said. And that's when I decided to get up, and I said, "I'll go look for him. I mean, how far can he be, right?" I took about 2 steps the way Mike had left, and that's when I saw a figure emerging through the fog. It was Mike, and he was coming back with firewood, except the way he was walking was very dull. As he approached the campfire, his movements were mechanical, almost as if he was in a trance. Sarah, always the one to confront difficult situations, broke the silence. "Did you get lost or something?" He turned to look at her. "I'm fine. I found firewood." The unease in the air deepened, each of us sensing that something was wrong. Mike's presence felt off. It was as if a shadow had draped itself over his being, distorting his familiar features. His whole demeanor was replaced by an emotionless state. I couldn't help but notice something strange about Mike. He was sitting slightly apart from the group, staring directly at the flames, not even saying anything. I was thinking he was just tired or scared, so I tried to engage him in conversation. "Hey Mike, remember that one time we got lost and had to spend an extra night out?" But he didn't respond. Well, he did. but his response was delayed, and when he did answer, his tone was off. It lacked the seriousness I was used to. It was almost like he was hearing us talk, but responding to questions a moment too late. You mean when we thought the squirrels were plotting against us? Luke chimed in, trying to break the growing tension. Yeah, that's right, and you were convinced that the woods had eyes and ears. Mike's laugh, if you could even call it that, sounded forced. A hollow echo, you can say. Yeah, good times, he replied, his gaze distant. Emily leaned ahead with a concerned voice. Hey, Mike, are you okay? You're acting different. Mike then looked at her. I'm not sure. Something about this place. It's like it's under my skin. Jennifer's voice held a note of unease. Weird things have been happening tonight. The voices, the fog. I think we should consider leaving. Mike's gaze remained fixed on the flames. His voice almost lowered to a whisper. Maybe that's not a bad idea. The gravity of his words hung heavy in the air. We exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the strange things happening, now impossible to ignore. I looked around at my friends, each face reflecting a mix of fear. It was a painful realization that the place that had once been our escape was now a source of unease. Well, we should leave. Something isn't right here, I said. Nods of agreement followed, the decision being unanimous this time. The prospect of abandoning our camping trip was sad, but the safety of our group came first, and so we started packing everything. It took about 30 minutes to break everything down, and by then, it was now completely dark. However, as we finished packing our gear and glanced around to make sure everything was ready, a sinking feeling settled in our stomachs. Mike, who had been acting distant and detached, was just standing by the edge of the clearing, staring into the depths of the woods. Unlike the rest of us, he hadn't lifted a finger to help with the packing, and his usual seriousness and energetic self replaced by an almost trance-like state. Hey Mike, are you alright, man? I said with a concerned tone. Mike's response was slow and distant, as though his mind was somewhere far away. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking. Jennifer, exchanging a worried look with all of us. It was clear that something had changed in Mike. As we started getting ready to walk from the campfire back to the van, that's when we heard it. Somewhere in the distance, we heard another voice. It sounded like Mike's voice, and it was calling out, sounding confused and pleading for help. And that's when Emily said, so if that's Mike calling out to us, then who is? As we turned around, Mike was still staring into the woods, but that's when his body started contorting, almost glitching like. Chaos erupted. Jennifer, always quick thinking, threw a log towards this Mike that was standing on the edge of the campsite and yelled everyone to run back to the van. Guided by adrenaline and our flashlights, we dashed through the woods. As we all ran with our belongings, I dared to not look back. But still, a horrible screech drew my attention back to see what had caused this. And that's when I stopped in my tracks to see that whatever this thing was now had its limbs stretched and twisted, reshaping into something that defied the laws of nature. But it was the face that sent a shockwave of terror through me. The human features contorted and elongated, the skin stretching and warping as if it was struggling to contain the monstrosity beneath. The eyes, once familiar and warm, became stretched out and unnaturally slanted, their color shifting to an abyss-like blackness that seemed to absorb all light. The nose receded and resembled the snout of a goat. The mouth was a grotesque smile. its lips curling back to reveal rows of jagged, pointed teeth. Every detail was a horrifying mixture of human and animal. That's when I felt my body come back to life, and I yelled to keep running and to not look back, not knowing that even if they got to the van, how would they even get inside because I had the key? I kept running and running, thinking what would happen if this thing caught up to us. And then, there, in the distance, I saw the clearing of the trees and familiar sight of the van, and heard my friends screaming to hurry up. As I neared the van, I saw that the real Mike, with his clothes torn, was there with the rest of the group. With no time to lose, we climbed into the van and sped off. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw this creature standing where we had parked at. After about 5 minutes of driving, Luke finally spoke and said, "What the fuck was that?" That's when Mike finally spoke and said, "When I ventured into the woods, the fog seemed to grow denser with each step I was taking. Soon, my flashlight was the only thing piercing the gloom. I had collected some firewood when I heard whispers. I heard y'all's voices calling out to me. I tried tracing them but got lost. Then, I saw me, or a copy of me. It looked like my reflection in a murky pond." Mike then stopped talking, struggling to find the words. This other me was trying to draw me closer, with words and voices that belonged to you all. That's when I decided to hide behind a tree, using the shadows as cover, and every time I tried to make a move towards the camp, it seemed to sense me, always blocking my path. I thought I was done for, but then I remember a stream we crossed earlier. That's when I made a dash for it and jumped in. The flow carried me downstream, away from that thing. I crawled out, exhausted, and walked towards the van. That's when I started yelling for you all, and that's when you all came running from the forest. As we were speeding away, all the trees were whipping past us, their branches scratching the sides of my van, almost like desperate fingers trying to pull us back. Over the noise of the engine and the pounding of my heart, that's when we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere, all at once. As I kept my eyes on the road, the headlights briefly illuminated a monstrous form darting between the trees. The creature was a horrible version of a goat, but massive in scale, murky gray, almost appearing slick in the dim light, with ragged scars and patches of bare skin. Its eyes, though, were the most terrifying. Deep, soulless pits of black. "What the hell is that?" screamed Emily, clutching her seat. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, with the van's engine roaring. The creature, with an incredible speed, moved through the dense forest, its every leap and bound bringing it closer to us. As we went through a sharp bend, this thing lunged, its massive jaws snapping inches from the rear window. Luke, who was in the back seat, rummaged through our camping supplies and hurled a flare out the window. It lit up the surrounding area in a bright crimson glow, distracting the creature for a few seconds. I continued speeding, tires screeching, and for a moment, it seemed we had lost it. But then, a screeching noise that echoed through the woods. The creature resumed its relentless pursuit, its form now even more twisted and grotesque under the flickering light of the flare. The road ahead clear, revealing the bridge we had crossed earlier. Realizing this might be our only chance, Sarah shouted, "Get across the bridge, now!" We barreled into the bridge, the van shaking under the strained boards. As we reached the halfway point, a deafening roar filled the air. Looking back, we saw the creature stop at the bridge's edge, with what looked to be an evil smirk, an image that still haunts me to this day. I'll even provide a drawing at the end if anybody wants to see it. After a few hours of driving, we finally left the woods and found the safety of the dim-lit streets of a nearby town. We pulled into a Waffle House, and we sat in a corner booth as we recounted the evening's events. trying to make sense of it all. Jennifer, her hands wrapped around her mug. That old man, Togue, she began. He knew too much about the whispering goat. Don't you think? There was agreement between us. I started rubbing my head and responded. It's not just that he knew about it. Remember how he just appeared out of nowhere? And how, after he left, things immediately took a turn for the worse. The eyes of Sarah widened, and the way he emphasized not to trust familiar voices, almost like he was setting us up, giving us a clue about the thing we were about to face. Mike, looking more pale than usual, added, when I was in the woods, trying to escape that thing, I heard more than our voices. I swear, I heard the voice of that old man calling me, trying to draw me in. I think he might have been the whispering goat himself. We all exchanged glances. The thought was too horrific to fully grasp. Had this creature taken on the look of an old man to toy with us, to get close, to study us? But why would he warn us about himself? It doesn't make sense, I said. Unless he enjoys the chase, the fear. Maybe for an old creature, the hunting is more thrilling, Luke said. We all sat in heavy silence, pondering the possibility as we pieced it all together. The sudden appearance of Togue, his detailed stories, and the hunting events. The conclusion became clear. The old man, with deep-set wrinkles and tales of old, had likely been the whispering goat himself. That happened a few months ago, and the trauma still lingers. First up was when we lost touch with Mike, who moved to another state, I guess to escape the memories. From that moment on, everything else changed. The once tight bonds between us frayed. Our group chats grew quiet, and any future gathering ceased. And the annual camping trip became nothing more than a distant memory. The haunting echoes of that night lingered, and every rustling of leaves, every faint whisper, served as a chilling reminder of the presence that lurked in the woods. The memory of the whispering goat and twisted grin haunted my dreams. A constant replay of the terror that unfolded before us. The mere thought of venturing into the wilderness sent shivers down my spine, a sensation of impending doom that I couldn't shake. As time passed, the memory of that horrifying encounter began to fade. We did all end up going separate ways, and I found methods to cope with the nightmares I experienced afterwards. I even went and talked with a counselor, because every corner that I looked, every voice I heard, at night when I was falling asleep, I swear, I would sometimes hear those faint whispers. Last night, I was walking alone in a park near my apartment. The sun had set, and the moon was shining bright. I quickened my pace as the nighttime brought back episodes and bad memories of the night in the forest. With my heart racing as the memories of that night flooded back, that's when I heard it. A faint distant sound that sent shivers down my spine. Whispers, soft, as if carried by the wind itself. I stopped in my tracks, straining to make out the words, feeling a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I heard my name, Leo. My heart raced, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, and the whispering seemed to grow near. And then, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, much like the one we had heard that night in the woods. Fear flooded my veins, and I finally tore my gaze away from the darkness, fleeing from the park as if my life depended on it, which at this point it most likely did. The whispers and the noises seemed to chase me, echoing in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I locked every door and window, heart pounding like a drum. I tried to rationalize what happened, telling myself it was all in my head. Anxiety, and a product of what happened in the past in the woods. But deep down, I knew it was the whispering goat. As the night continued, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that something evil lurked just beyond my vision. And just as I was about to close my eyes that night to try to sleep, I heard it again, the whispers, closer now, almost like a soft breath against my ear. Leo, Leo. My blood turned to ice, and I clutched my cover. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadowy figure, its eyes reflecting the dim light like deep, soulless pits. The figure's mouth opened, and it spoke, its voice using all of my friends' voices, distorted and nightmarish.
We missed you, Leo.
With my eyes never leaving the figure, with trembling hands, I rushed to the front door, my heart pounding so loud that I couldn't even hear anything else. And then, just as I reached past the door, I heard one last whisper, faint but unmistakable. Run. I bursted out the house, leaving everything behind. I got inside my old trusted van and sped away to my parents' house, who lived about 2 hours away. And I never went back again. It's almost midnight. I'm at my parents' house, and here I am, sharing and writing this to you all, in the hopes to warn you. Everything is real. It's not in my head, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows, whispering its haunting lullaby. Those moments when you second guess a distant call your name, when you are alone at home tonight, in bed, falling asleep. Do not be swayed by the voices that you think you know.